We're on. Well, welcome to Journey Through the Bible for January 13th. First of all, to you at home, my apologies that the camera cut off before we ended our lesson last week. So we're going to do a brief review and pick up where the camera has stopped after the issue of baptism. I think we were pretty much had covered that issue last week. So as a quick review, we talked about 4 different words for taxes in the New Testament: didakmon or temple tax, kinsos, tax on individuals, phoros, a word for all taxes, and telos refers to duties that were leveled at ports of entries. But we did not talk about all the other types of taxes in detail, the words that are not in the New Testament, but there were many other taxes.
Are you saying didakmon or didakmon?
Didakmon.
Okay.
Yeah. And then Matthew's purpose, we talked about that last week. Matthew's purpose was to convince the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. Contains more than 60 quotations from the Old Testament. We looked at some examples of them. We also talked about Matthew's theme, the kingdom. The kingdom of heaven is only found in Matthew, but it occurs there 32 different times. And then we looked at the outline of Matthew, the kingdom of heaven. Let's back up here. Yeah, the kingdom of heaven, and 2 major turning points in Matthew's gospel from that time on, recorded in 417 and 1621, and those are the basis for our outline that comes from Kingsbury's commentary on Matthew. The person of Jesus the Messiah, we got pretty much through that section. We've got just a little bit there to pick up this from last week. The proclamation of Jesus the Messiah, will be moving through a lot of that section this week. And then finally, the suffering and death of the Messiah. We also talked about the 5 great teaching sections that are in the book of Matthew. Each one ends when Jesus had finished. So we have the Sermon on the Mount that we will get to tonight, and probably chapter 10, the commission of the 12 to announce the kingdom. These are the important characteristics in Matthew's gospel. And then last week we looked at the first section, the person of Jesus the Messiah. We covered the first 7 of the 9 sections that are in this division of Matthew, chapters 1 through 4. And so we're going to pick up tonight with the temptation of Jesus. So the temptation of Jesus took place in the Judean desert, likely between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea. If you ever get a chance to visit Jerusalem, Israel, you'll find that as you leave Jerusalem and go down to Jericho, you drop below sea level. You also go through the Judean desert, which covers this entire area here to the south. It covers also territory between Jerusalem and Jericho. It is a very barren place out in the middle of that desert. And so somewhere in this area is where Jesus' temptation took place as he went out into the desert. Of course, you remember Qumran that we've talked about. The Dead Sea Scrolls come from that location. We've talked about En Gedi before, which is where David hid from Saul because of the caves. There's also a notable stream there at En Gedi that flows regularly, and so there's a regular supply of water. We've also talked about Masada. We'll talk about that more as we come further into the New Testament and talk about the Jewish revolt. But that was the final stronghold that the rebels held out. Didn't fall to the Romans till AD 70. So again, here is Bethlehem. You'll remember right next to Bethlehem was Herod's fortress. The Herodian or Herodium, pronounced different ways. It's also the place where Herod was buried, we believe, right there. And tonight we're going to talk about, on the other side of the Dead Sea, the companion fortress to the Herodian called Machaerus, where John the Baptist was imprisoned. So, somewhere in this vicinity is where Jesus went out into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights. You can read about that in Matthew chapter 4. Here's a picture of En-Gedi, the spring, and it may have been somewhere near this place. This is why David was hiding out in the caves near En-Gedi, because there's a regular supply of water there, and so it's a really beautiful spring. Now, if you turn the other way and look just the opposite direction, you can look through a little valley that opens up straight out on the Dead Sea. So it's kind of interesting to look from this spring to all that barren territory out in the Dead Sea. This being fresh water, the Dead Sea, of course, being water you don't want to drink. We talked about that Sunday. Temptation of Jesus, again, you can see overlooking the Dead Sea here. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry, and the tempter came to him and offered him 3 temptations. And you're probably aware that at each of these 3 temptations, Jesus quoted scripture to the devil and rebuked the devil's temptations. So let's move on to our last point in this section. Jesus begins his ministry. He relocates to Capernaum, and that's where he makes the center of his ministry. Capernaum was a fishing village on the very north end of the Sea of Galilee. Sea of Galilee being 9 miles wide and 12 miles long. And that was the hometown, of course, of Peter. Peter originally from Bethsaida, but then had moved to Capernaum because of the fishing business of Zebedee that he conducted there. And then last week in the class here, and you at home didn't get to see this, so I'm going to run through these slides for you very quickly. This is the Sea of Galilee looking from Capernaum, looking south. You can see the Jordanian hills on the east side on your left, the hills of Galilee on the right. Sea of Galilee, of course, being below sea level, and these hills rise as much as 3,000 feet. It's very much like being in a bowl when you're out on the Sea of Galilee. This is a picture of Capernaum from the air. You can see many of the excavations and then a lot of territory around the village that they haven't excavated. This is a monastery. This building here is a shrine that's built over the top of what we believe is Peter's house. And this here is the White Synagogue that we'll look at in a few minutes. Now, I told the class last week, one of the things that I really enjoyed is walking these streets between the White Synagogue, which was built, we think, on top of the older synagogue, because they're probably places that Jesus himself would have walked. And it's a pretty impressive feeling to be walking on stone streets that Jesus himself would have walked on, and of course Peter and the rest of the apostles. So here's the White Synagogue, dates sometime between the 2nd and the 4th century. We're not exactly sure, but underneath the White Synagogue is this black stone, which they believe is the remnants of the 1st century synagogue. Holy sites in Israel and actually throughout the Middle East tend to be built successively on top of each other. So because of some donations from some people, probably God-fearing Gentiles who were fairly wealthy, which is what a couple of these inscriptions are all about, the White Synagogue was built on the remains of the synagogue that would have been there in Jesus' day. And then there's the spaceship, or the flying saucer that I like to call it. It seems like when you go to Israel, almost every place has some shrine built on top of it. But you can go up into this building and look down on Peter's house. You'll notice the octagon shape. That indicates a Byzantine church, which dates about 300 years to 400 years after the time of Jesus. But typically, again, when these churches were built, they were built on sites that already were decided that had religious significance. And so that's why this, they think, is the likely location of Peter's house. Again, you can see some of the remains in the background here in Capernaum. So Capernaum, to me, when I visited Israel in 1988 and spent a couple of months there working an archaeological dig, this was probably the most meaningful site that I went to in Israel. And so if you get to go to Israel, you probably want to make sure that you get to go to Capernaum. It's a pretty important place. The other place that I really enjoyed was in Nazareth. Went to the marketplace in Nazareth, which is just a little narrow snaking path that's probably 6 feet wide, has stalls on either side of it as it winds up the hill, a drainage ditch in the middle, which is an ancient sewer, and they're still out there hawking their wares. And so we ran into some fishermen who were actually Palestinian Christians who were selling their catch in baskets on their shoulders. They were so excited to meet Christians from America that we had a little impromptu dance in the middle of the marketplace there in Nazareth. Yeah. So, and fishmongers. Yeah. Interesting smell from a fishmonger, in case you've never run across a fishmonger. And I wish I had smell-o-vision that I could show you, what it looked like and what it smelled like, because the smells in the marketplace were just nothing like what you're going to find at the Kroger here, I can guarantee you.
If you were at my house, you could smell my brothers after they've been fishing all weekend on the lake.
Yeah. That fish do leave a presence. And fishermen in Galilee would have been known you would have known before they got there that they were coming. All right, let's talk about proclamation of Jesus the Messiah. We're moving into the second section now, chapters 4 through 16 of the book of Matthew. We start out with the call of the 12. One of the earliest acts of Jesus was to call 4 of the 12 disciples, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And we're going to look more at them when we get to Matthew chapter 10. And so I'll come back to that when we come back to chapter 10. Now, Matthew describes the work of Jesus in Matthew 4:23, also in chapter 9, as teaching, preaching, and healing. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness among the people. And so this work in chapter 10 is the work that he is going to send out his 12 apostles and commission them to do, as well as he himself was doing that. Then we come in chapter 5 to the first teaching section that we've come to in our study in the book of Matthew. It's the Sermon on the Mount, the longest public teaching section of Jesus, runs for 3 chapters, probably the most famous section of Jesus in the book of Matthew as well. Now, Luke has a companion sermon to this called the Sermon on the Plain in Luke chapter 6 that appears to be a shortened version of what Jesus delivered here. The sermon in Matthew seems to have been delivered at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Luke places it more towards the end of Jesus' ministry. But it wouldn't have been unusual for Jesus to have delivered a similar teaching at various times and in various locations, because he's talking about absolute truth, and of course absolute truth that many people in different locations hadn't heard. And so Jesus may not have had a fresh sermon every week. He may have reused material depending on his audience. So the Sermon on the Mount contains a number of different types of literature. There's poetry, there are parables, there's analogy, and other forms as well. Remember when we talked about scriptural interpretation, that the type of scripture that you're looking at, the type of literature is very important. So we're going to begin with the Sermon on the Mount in the Beatitudes. This is the prelude to the Sermon on the Mount. In the Beatitudes, Jesus talked about the 8 internal characteristics of his disciples, characteristics that God blesses. In the Beatitudes, Jesus reverses the standards of the world and popularly held Jewish ideas of the time that were being taught by the rabbis, and we'll look at some of them in a few minutes. So here is a list of the 8 Beatitudes. First of all, there are those who are poor in spirit, those who recognize their spiritual unworthiness. There are those who mourn, who can't get enough of God, who want to experience God's presence. There is the meek, those who accept whatever God decides. There are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. They recognize that only God can fill the void that is in their lives. There are the merciful, those people who give to others what they need rather than what they deserve. The pure in heart, those who set aside their own agenda to follow the agenda of God. The peacemakers, people who are willing to stand in the gap, mediating peace between God and man, as well as man and man. And finally, there are those who are persecuted, those who are so for God that they become enemies of God's enemy, the evil one. So the Beatitudes clarify how disciples of Jesus should think. The rest of the message of the Sermon on the Mount then comes from these, and Jesus discusses, if you think like this, then this is the way you should act. And so that's what most of the rest of the Sermon on the Mount is going to be contained with, talking about how you should act. And Jesus begins with 2 common examples everyone in his day would have understood: salt and light. True disciples have an influence on the world and not the other way around, according to Jesus. Now, just this past Sunday, we talked about the fact that there were 3 major sources of salt in Jesus' day. These are the major sources. There would have been other ways that people could have gotten salt as well, but the 3 main ways to get salt were from the Mediterranean Sea, which was the best quality salt that you could get. Rock salt from mines. We talked about Mount Sodom at the south end of the Dead Sea, but there were other salt mines as well where salt could have come from. And then finally there was Dead Sea salt. Now, Mediterranean salt and rock salt. Mediterranean was the purest, generally 98% sodium chloride. Rock salt tended to be a little less pure, could be more depending on where it came from, but it's in general, it's at least 90% sodium chloride, and so you have some contaminants in it. But Dead Sea salt is actually only 30% sodium chloride and is made up of 50% magnesium chloride, which is not really what you want to put on your food. And we talked about the fact that the way you would distinguish whether you had good salt or not when you went to the salt cellar is just to put it on your tongue. If it was sharp, it was Mediterranean salt probably. If it was kind of bland, it might be some type of rock salt, maybe with some contaminants. If it was really bitter, it would have been Dead Sea salt. And there's always the possibility that some unscrupulous merchant could have mixed Dead Sea salt, which was used for topical skin problems, with one of these better qualities of salt just to improve his margins. And so Jesus uses that as an example about his disciples needed to be good salt, just like you needed good salt to preserve the fish on the Sea of Galilee and preserve your food. So Jesus' discussion about salt was probably about purity, good salt not being diluted. Then Jesus moves on in chapter 5, verse 17, to talk about the fulfillment of the law. Now Jesus makes it clear here that he's not trying to minimize the law, and he is not trying to change the law. Probably because the scribes and Pharisees had accused him of doing that. Jesus' aim was to help people understand who God was and what was behind the law, what God actually desires. Now, keep in mind that at this time, the scribes and the Pharisees, particularly the Pharisees, had set as their ambition to create a hedge around the law. And so that's what their tradition was all about hand washing and the other things that they accused Jesus and the disciples of doing were not transgressions of the law, but they were part of the Pharisees trying to put a hedge around the law to keep people from doing anything that might offend God. Of course, what we're talking about here is a works righteousness, that the Pharisees practiced a works righteousness, as do Orthodox Jews today. Their goal is to keep every little detail of the law, and they think by keeping every detail of the law, then you become righteous before God. Of course, Paul talks about that because he, having found Jesus, came to understand that there's no way, there's not enough that he could do to be righteous before God, and that he's always going to make mistakes and transgress those issues. So the fulfillment of the law, third section in the Sermon on the Mount. Fourth is 5 examples of the intent of the law that Jesus talks about to clarify for his disciples and those who were listening to him. The first 2 examples are actually from the 10 Commandments. The final 3 are from teaching that was common in Jesus' day. So let's look at these 5 examples of the intent of the law. Jesus' first example is about murder. Jesus went straight to the issue of what caused murder, and that was ill will between men. If you stop the root of crime, you stop the crime itself. Jesus said, "But I tell you, anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Anyone who says to his brother, Raka, which means fool, is answerable to the Sanhedrin. But anyone who says you fool will be in danger of the fires of hell." And so this is kind of a restatement that Jesus makes 3 times with ever-increasing consequences. So if you have ill will towards your brother, that's what leads to murder. And if you have no ill will, there won't be any murder. Secondly, he addresses the cause of adultery. Jesus said, "I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Scribes and Pharisees would have said, as long as he doesn't commit the act, he's not guilty. Jesus takes that another step further. Then Jesus talks about oaths, and in this one, he introduces it in these next 2 with, "You have heard it said." When he's making that quote, "You have heard it said," he is talking about the teachers of the Pharisees. The Pharisees used the precedent of great past teachers, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. I'll give you some examples. Here, Jesus addresses a biblical teaching that was being misinterpreted by the teachers of his day. They determined that taking an oath was fine so long as you fulfilled your oath. In Matthew 23 and 24, Jesus would accuse them of, you swear an oath and you swear it by the gold of the altar rather than by the altar of God. And so you're swearing by the metal, you're not swearing by the God of heaven and earth. So Jesus talks about a distortion of the way that they took oaths. But Jesus' advice is, "I tell you, don't swear at all, either by heaven, for it's God's throne, or by the earth, for it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king." He would go on to say, just let your yes be yes and your no be no. Do what you say, and you don't need to swear an oath in that regard. Now, let me remind you that oaths in Bible times were very popular ways to express oneself. One would swear on the name of their God, whether it was the God of Israel or some other God. And so there are very many of these things that are found in remains in ancient archaeological sites about oaths being taken in the name of God. Even today, people think very lightly of using the name of God to add emphasis to a statement or to express surprise. You've probably heard the phrase OMG referring to God before, and that's exactly what falls under what Jesus is talking about here. If you've gotten in the habit of using that phrase, you might want to stop. That's not a good thing to do, because the 10 Commandments says God will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. And so, not a position you want to be in as far as God is concerned. Example number 4, an eye for an eye. This law was known by the Jews as the law of retaliation, comes from the Old Testament, but actually it goes even further back. in the Old Testament to the Code of Hammurabi. It's a very ancient code, and that is that if you injure somebody and put out their eye, then the sentence was that your eye would be put out. Tooth for tooth. If you got into a fight with a person and knocked out their tooth, then your tooth would be knocked out. Here again, you hear this, you have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, don't resist an evil person. If somebody strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Jesus said, just be meek. Choose to be meek in these situations, and rather than trying to retaliate. And then, example number 5, love for your enemies. This is one of Jesus' most difficult teachings. Matthew 5:43, you've heard that it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Notice the rabbis were teaching, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But Jesus says, no, that's not good enough. You need to love your enemy as well. All right, from there we move on to number 5, the 5th section in the Sermon on the Mount. And this is positive practice of believers. In chapter 6, Jesus turns from the mistaken ideas of the law that have been taught by the scribes and Pharisees to the positive practices. How should you then live? How should you behave? And he discusses 5 topics which are relevant to his hearers: giving, prayer, fasting, wealth, and worry, all of which are pretty applicable in our day as well. So first, he talks about giving. During the Babylonian captivity, giving to the poor became a substitute for being able to give an offering at the temple. During the Babylonian captivity, since the temple had been destroyed, the offering couldn't be sent at that point. So Jesus confirms the spiritual benefit of giving to others, but suggests that the reason and method and the motive in which one gives to others is just as important as the giving itself. And he talks about not announcing your giving with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogue and in the streets. One of the popular ways that the wealthy would announce their giving in the temple would be in the court of women, which is where the offering boxes for the temple were scattered around the court of the women. And when they came in, they would bring in their money sacks. There would be a hole with a funnel in the top of the box, and they would make a big deal of shaking the bag to make as much noise as they could as the coins went into the money box. And Jesus says that kind of offering is not going to be acceptable as far as God is concerned. So if you're giving your offering in here, you might want to put in paper money or a check instead of using coins. Just an idea. The second thing Jesus addresses is prayer. Now this section contains the Lord's Prayer as well, but he begins with general instruction about prayer. Jesus teaches people how to pray simply and directly to God. Prayer in Jesus' day had become an elaborate ritual which often involved public performance and extensive repetition. And Jesus taught that a simple, humble prayer from the heart was a lot closer to the will of God than the elaborate rituals of his day. When you pray, go into your room, close the door, pray to your Father who is unseen, then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And then we finally come to